remind you that to join with your microphone muted, and we'll start shortly. We'll just give a couple more minutes. Welcome to those already who have joined us. We'll just give a couple more minutes for people to join us. It's 4 o'clock. We'll just give 1 minute and then we'll start. The Medical Needs in Schools workshop on anxiety. So welcome everybody. This is a Medical Needs in Schools workshop on anxiety. Just to let you know that a recording has started. If you do have any questions during the talk, if you would like to use the chat bar facility that can be found, please do add your questions here. So thank you for joining us today under what I know to be very challenging circumstances for us all. So wherever you are joining us from, welcome and thank you for giving your time to this important subject. Our guest speaker is Dr. Helen Griffith. I don't think a workshop on this subject has ever been so well timed, I'm sure you'll agree. So by way of introduction, I shall share with you the following about Helen. Helen is a consultant clinical psychologist. She specialises in working with children who have medical needs along with their families. Helen is based at Oxfordshire Children's Hospital, and she's worked on the Medical Needs in Schools project since the very beginning, 3 years ago. Helen is passionate about interprofessional working to best support children with medical needs to reach their full potential. Helen also works with professional organisations to ensure the needs of these children are highlighted at a policy and a strategy level. So Helen, welcome and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and just wanted to say thanks to you all for attending at what I know is a significantly challenging time at the moment for us all, and particularly in education when you've got so many logistical things going on at the moment. When we put this date in the diary, it was in a very different stage in the pandemic, and the talk I was going to be giving today was very different to what it's turned into, but hopefully timely. I'm going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes just talking through some slides. I've stuck to sort of some common questions that are cropping up throughout the pandemic at the moment, and I hope that would be helpful to you, and I'm very happy to come back and talk about aspects of anxiety in more detail at another time if that would be helpful, as I have kept the overview quite broad today. As Kate says, please do pop questions in the chat. I can't see any of you while I'm talking, so feel free to turn your cameras off if you want to, and we will pick up any questions at the end. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about pandemic-related challenges. As I say, it would be really remiss of me not to acknowledge the significant impact of the current stage of the pandemic on children's anxiety levels. Then we're going to think a bit more broadly about how anxiety works in the body and why being in the same storm might impact differently on some people rather than others. And finish up with some strategies and tips, both for the children that we work with, their families, and for ourselves as professionals during these challenging times. So we often hear this phrase about the pandemic, that we're all in the same storm. And what is really unique about this situation currently is that the young people we work with, their families, and us as people and professionals will all be facing challenges of a very similar nature, although they'll affect us all differently. And that's quite different to working with more typical presentations of anxiety in young people within the education setting, because we'll all be asking ourselves the same questions as young people and their families are facing, and we'll all be dealing with similar challenges. So this uniquely brings us to a very different situation when managing anxiety than we might usually be facing. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time reflecting on that. So for us as professionals, we'll have lots of thoughts going through our head, contributing to our own maybe worries, maybe anxiety, maybe stress levels about the current stage of the pandemic. So what are the risks? How will risks be managed? Some of the practical issues. How will people cope? Will I catch coronavirus? What do I start planning for? When do I start planning? And all of those dilemmas that we will be thinking through as professionals and as people ourselves. And of course, many of those same challenges will be facing the young people and their families that we are working with. So we will have lots of shared understanding of what makes us anxious at this particular time. And of course, that will bring some positives of being able to sort of empathise and maybe problem solve, but also some challenges in terms of controlling and containing how we feel about things, how worried we might be and what our particular concerns are, and whether or not that impacts on our work with the families in school. So thinking about the pandemic creating a really unique situation for us all to be in when managing anxiety, whether that's related to the pandemic or whether that's pre-existing anxiety in our young people, it's important to start by thinking about what is anxiety and how does it work in the body, and from there we can think about what to do with it. So in terms of a starting point with an intervention with a child with anxiety, we would often think about taking it back to the biology of anxiety in our body to really normalise the fact that we all experience anxiety, and it's actually a really helpful thing that our brains and bodies do. If we didn't have anxiety, then we wouldn't be able to maybe revise for exams because we wouldn't worry about them. We wouldn't jump out of the way of a road when a car beeps. So anxiety is really necessary, and it's a biological phenomena in our body that we all experience. And for perhaps older children, teenagers and their parents, I like to think about the biology of anxiety as a way of maybe demystifying and destigmatizing that anxiety is okay and happens to everyone. So it's really all to do with this amygdala, which is the part of the brain, I call it the fear center, and it's the thing that activates when we sense something that's stressful or a threat. And one of the most important things for us all to take on board is that stress can be real, it can be perceived, or it can be imagined. So even a thought going through our mind, whether it's real or not, whether it's likely to come true or not, is enough to set that amygdala off as if it were actually happening. And what we know when the amygdala gets triggered is that it causes a chemical reaction in our body. And some people might have heard of the fight-flight response and subsequently been updated to the fight, flight or freeze response. Many young people will have heard of that. They'll also have heard of adrenaline, which is one of the chemicals that is released when the amygdala gets fired off. And what we know is that this causes our body to react. So our heart rate quickens, our blood pumps faster, and our muscles get ready to go. And during this process, the thinking part of our brain becomes less effective, and that sort of coins the phrase act first, think later. So really we want to think about how that impacts on trying to manage anxiety in the moment when our body is on high alert and our thinking part of the brain is disabled by some of those adrenaline and other chemicals that flood our body at this time. But what we know is that there's a feedback loop between our brain and our body. So as our bodies react, it gives the signal to our brain that something's going on, something's happening, and brings that feeling of discomfort. So some of the thoughts might follow, like, oh gosh, this feels uncomfortable. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe my heart is beating. Maybe my tummy hurts. And that can cause even more worry. So what's wrong? What's wrong at the moment? I don't feel quite right. And for children and their parents, that can even exacerbate the initial worry, because all of a sudden we're worried that something is wrong with our body. As those thoughts reach our amygdala, again, that sets that amygdala off, and more chemicals are released into our body, furthering the anxiety reaction. And sometimes it's actually the bodily sensations in themselves that stop us from doing what we want to do, not even the thoughts. So we might be worried about maybe going to the supermarket, maybe going into school, whatever those worries initially were, but actually it might be that worry about the stomach pain, or I might need to go to the toilet, or I might be really red and people might notice, that actually become part of the barrier to doing what we need to do. So we know that anxiety impacts on many aspects of our life, but it usually starts with a worry. It starts with a thought, and that might be triggered by something happening, or it might be triggered by a memory. That then causes our body to react and our body to feel strange. We have an emotional response of feeling worried or stressed, and then ultimately we might do something differently to try and help the anxiety to go away. So that might be we might avoid something that we were meant to do. We might perhaps think, okay, I'm going to go and listen to some music. We might go and talk to a friend. But this could become a vicious cycle if the things that we do to help us feel better in the short term, in the long term, don't tackle what the original worry or problem was. And I've put these words in bold just to highlight that if we can tackle any bits of these vicious cycles that can get created, it will help to break them in the long term. So that's tackling the thoughts, tackling the way our body feels, tackling the feelings that we experience, or tackling the things that we do in order to lead to a different outcome. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. One of the impacts of coronavirus compared to sort of some of the challenge we face in more usual times is that we have this kind of chronic presentation of worry and anxiety. So the orange line, I've sort of reflected how we might feel in work. So with each additional challenge that you guys have faced in education, with changing rules, changing logistics, we have sort of this higher baseline that's much more chronic in nature. So every bit of news that you hear might lead to a spike. It might not be a spike of the kind that I see when I see a spider, where I might start screaming and running away. So it's probably not at that level, but it's not going down to our baseline, and we're having more frequent peaks. And this will probably be the case for many of our young people experiencing anxiety throughout the pandemic. Also, perhaps young people that are quite thoughtful about the news stories that they're hearing and so on. And really the physiological effect on us over time of this can be a higher baseline of stress and anxiety, which can then cause some difficulties, perhaps when it's time to go back to school and we're already feeling quite on edge about things. So one of the phrases that's commonly used is that we're all in the same boat, and some people have updated that to we're all in the same storm. But I think it's worth considering why some of us react differently to the same situation than others. And we know from the research that not everybody experiencing the same stressor or trigger will react in the same way. That's down to lots of different factors which are really complex to unpick, such as the temperament or personality type of us. Are we always generally thinking about things, or do we tend to sort of put things to the back of our mind? The family factors, so parental mental health, perhaps things like drug and alcohol use. Societal factors, so maybe experiencing discrimination, prejudice, stigma, what resources we have available to us, and that can include help and support available to us, and what's happened to us in the past. So we bring all of these things with us to each anxious or anxiety-provoking situation that we face, and it will come together to help to determine our response. We know that at the moment, one of the factors impacting on young people and their families are the restrictions that have increased for people who fall into shielding categories. We know that children with physical health conditions are already at a higher risk of mental health difficulties, and they're already exposed to difficult circumstances and many, many demands on their time in terms of hospital appointments and so on. And if we add to that the statistics, which is often used to reassure healthy people, that most of the people who experience the worst outcomes of coronavirus have an underlying health condition, but there's an inadvertently distressing message to people who already have health conditions about the increased risk that they might be under. So thinking about parents, perhaps children with health conditions, and the children themselves, that's likely to lead to an increase in anxiety around the current pandemic. We know that there's an increased risk of mental health needs in children throughout previous pandemics, and some studies have looked at the impact of quarantine on mental health. And we know that loneliness is a particular factor that we need to be worried about and to think about the impact on mental health in the long term. If we lose links with others, we can feel excluded, and that can lead not just to anxiety, but also to issues with low mood. And that mental health services are likely to see an increased impact on the mental health of young people following the pandemic. And if you want to look into more detail at the rates of mental health needs in children throughout the pandemic, the course-based study, I've got the link at the end of the presentation, is a reputable source which regularly releases updated information on their findings. So this is probably something that we all know, but it's always worth a reminder. How might anxiety show itself in children? So because of that impact of the amygdala on all of those chemicals in our body, we might see some things that we don't necessarily expect. So we might see some increase in anger and aggression as we are in that fight or flight response. We might see the more withdrawn behaviours or regression behaviours, as perhaps we feel less able to think through problem solving, less able to ask for help because we're worried about things. We might see more increased clinginess, attachment seeking behaviours, wanting parents more, wanting to be closer to people, asking lots of questions because as our logical bit of our brain has been shut down, maybe we haven't taken it in the first time, or maybe we've heard updated information, and lots of disruption to our usual routines, sleep, nightmares, and so on. So thinking about what can we do, we know anecdotally from professionals in education that much of your time is being spent at the moment talking to young people about their worries and their anxieties about the pandemic, and that's on top of maybe any pre-existing worries. So I'm going to think about some evidence-based approaches, not just to the pandemic, but hopefully generally helpful tips and strategies that we can think about with our young people and their families that we're working with. First of all, I wanted to start off by talking about the concept of containment. And the reason why I thought this was really important to talk about today was because I don't think it's always possible to do that thing that we like to do to help people with anxiety, which is to reassure them. Of course, at the moment, there's a lot in the news and in the media about risk. And it's probably not always helpful or accurate to be able to reassure people 100% about things. So thinking about this concept of just containing anxiety can be much more helpful at this particular point. Similarly, most young people at the moment will be experiencing subclinical thresholds of anxiety, so not necessarily at a level where they need specialist mental health treatment. Of course, some will, but most won't. And actually, what can we do in our existing roles to just contain that anxiety, to keep it manageable? So I've popped in here really the dictionary definition of containment to try and highlight what we try to achieve with containing conversations. So really holding that emotion, having the capacity to be able to deal with it, to keep it under control and to limit it spilling out into other aspects of life. So anxiety is okay and it's there, but what we don't want it doing is pervading all aspects of life so that we can't enjoy ourselves, we can't engage in activities that we need to or want to do. So that's really the purpose of holding or containing anxiety as opposed to treating it or reassuring. How do conversations work when we're trying to contain anxiety? There's a few steps to think through when we're trying to do this. So the first step would be identifying the emotion. So recognizing that a young person might be looking a bit worried, sounding a bit worried, and to really name that for the young person so that they feel validated and they feel heard. And that's very different to things like don't worry about it or try not to worry about it or there's no need to worry about it. It's acknowledging that whether they need to, whether they should be, they are, and that's okay. So following on from that, we would be normalizing that, again, whether we feel like it's valid or not, but saying it's okay to be worried and everybody worries about things. Acknowledging that the emotions can be tricky and that's okay too. So it's very difficult sometimes to sit with those feelings and that's okay because they're not very nice generally to feel anxious or to feel sad. But thinking also about our own words and responses, and clearly we are all impacted on by the pandemic at the moment, and we will all be wanting to express ourselves and also to come on board with the fact that it's very difficult for lots of people at the moment. And we're all feeling some degree of anxiety and stress about it. But there's a big difference in terms of how our emotional response might be. So, oh gosh, it's terrible. Did you just see the news? We've got no idea what's going to happen, no idea what school's going to look like on Monday. And actually, as an adult, with our cognitive ability to rationalise, to step back, to think things through and hopefully to manage our own emotions, that is appropriate to share with our colleagues, with our friends. But for young people where maybe they don't have the sophisticated understanding of illness and of risk, that can be very uncontaining. So thinking about the conversations being replaced with things like, yeah, it's a really difficult situation and lots of people are thinking about the things that can help. As soon as we know more, we'll talk it through with you and so on. So it's not giving false reassurance, it's not denying feelings of anxiety, but it's much more containing in terms of we're all working together on things that will help. And making sure that our tone is as calm and as steady as possible as we're talking with young people about these things. Thinking about the anxiety itself, so if a young person is expressing more anxious thoughts or questions, being curious about understanding what is the anxiety actually about, what is it that you're worried about, what do you worry that will happen. So asking questions to find out what the worries are, making a list, and thinking about problem solving. So some of these questions or worries might need a bit more information from a certain source. Some of them will be appropriate to reassure because it's something that you can do that for. Some things could be helped with an action. And how can you in your role support the child with those, or how can you help them get to the person that can support them with those specific worries? Thinking about a feelings box or a worries box, where young people can have an opportunity throughout the week to contain their own worries by putting them in the box until time for an adult to talk them through. And older children use notepads or use the notes function on their phone if they have one to write down those worries as they crop up. For feelings of anxiety in the body, there's breathing and relaxation exercises, and I've got some resources at the end that you can direct young people to. And thinking about agency and control. So even if we don't know or we can't plan, how do we communicate that in a containing way? So maybe we don't know the answer right now, but we can reassure young people that as soon as we do know, we'll communicate it, and this is how we will communicate it to them. And if you look through some of these strategies, you think back to the 4 aspects that that we know impact on that anxiety vicious cycle. So the thoughts would be tackled by the being curious about the worries, making the list and doing some problem solving. The feelings box will deal with some of the emotional expression. The feelings of anxiety in the body will be tackled by the breathing and relaxation, and the things that we do will be impacted on by giving as much agency and control as possible. So thinking about anxiety being driven by uncertainty, and there are lots of changes at the moment. Children may wake up with a different plan to the plan that they had before, whether that's to do with school, whether that's to do with changing childcare, who's going to be around in the day, what they're allowed to do, who they're allowed to see. All of this can obviously trigger anxiety. So thinking about some top tips here in terms of encouraging routine and structure where possible. So that might be things like bedtime, dinner time, time getting up in the morning, the things that we can have some control over. Thinking of the things that help us feel safe, so whether that's having cuddles with our parents or something that we like to take to bed to us, with us, and thinking of those containing conversations that we can have with young people so that our stress and anxiety doesn't inadvertently spill into theirs. Having that space to share worries and concerns. So I know that many of my colleagues who work in education are having some unstructured time with young people remotely, where they have opportunities to talk about things that are worrying them and ask questions. Thinking about limiting access to information. So when have we got the news on? When are we allowing time on phones and so on? And having time where we are watching TV that's unrelated to coronavirus, and just some pure escapism or pleasurable activities. Thinking about the conversations that we have in front of young people, as I've already touched on, considering the tone and use of language, and always being honest but developmentally appropriate to the level of the child. So not going into terribly complex explanations with younger children, but not giving false reassurance also. And it's really important that even in young people that maybe not displaying too much anxiety, that we think about generally how do we foster resilience. And there's a really great British Psychological Society document for education staff written by our education psychologists on the topic of fostering resilience in schools. I've got the link at the end. These are the things that are highlighted as providing a really good baseline for our young people. And we know from the literature that purely spending time with others on its own is good, but it's not enough. And we need to think about how we can foster a sense of belonging and shared purpose in our young people. So maybe thinking about, can we link up young people remotely to do tasks together? How do we give the feedback about the work that they're submitting, that it's been looked at and it's been valued and so on. And just taking it that one step further as much as we possibly can within, of course, the resource implications that the pandemic has led to. So there's a lot more detail in that document that I've referenced at the end if you'd like to have a bit more of a in-depth read of that. So here I've popped some key British Psychological Society documents that we've produced with young people and families where appropriate. So some advice on shielding with children and young people, managing uncertainty, resilience and coping, talking about illness. I've referenced the course-based study, which has a huge amount of detail on the mental health statistics coming out in the UK in the pandemic, and some really excellent resources from their partner organisation, Emerging Minds. And that resource I've linked to there is a really excellent document for families with some top tips and resources on managing anxiety during the pandemic. And through the Medical Needs in Schools project, we've got a COVID Back to the Classroom document, also with hopefully some helpful tips and advice. And finally, at the end there, the Young Minds website, which, if you're not aware of Young Minds, they're really excellent, and they have a crisis messenger service, which I know lots of young people have been using throughout the pandemic to get additional emotional support. So hopefully, if we can circulate the slides, those links there are all clickable, that will take you straight through to the websites. To finish up with acknowledging how difficult it is for us all at the moment, and in our professional capacity, we will be experiencing lots of increased anxiety and stress about things. And these are some of the signs that we might be perhaps a bit more anxious than usual. I've chose January to do dry January, which is maybe not the smartest idea at the moment, but I'm also doing lots of cycling and trying to be a bit healthier, as we all usually are in January, to combat maybe some of the effects of the pandemic related anxiety, and that's been really helpful. But to think about, when is it becoming a problem? When are we using our coping mechanisms perhaps to a degree that's unhelpful, or when are we finding that anxiety is maybe getting the better of us? And if our sleep is impacted, if we're experiencing perhaps stomach pains, headaches and so on, if we're struggling to get things done and struggling to concentrate, those are all signs that we might need to think about our own self-care and prioritise perhaps us, especially in such a digital world where we're sitting at our computers all day long. So in terms of some top tips here, I won't go through them all in a great amount of detail, just thinking about our thought patterns. Are there particular times of day when they're more bothersome? When are they helpful? Writing down those helpful thoughts, those helpful questions and plans, and thinking about when are they unhelpful, and how we can use imagery and distraction and bring us back to the here and now to manage some of those things. And if you're anything like me, you'll be in a million WhatsApp groups and you'll be getting information at all times of day and night, and thinking about how you can set some limits around that, maybe talking with your colleagues about, you know, when you might be wanting to switch off and when it's necessary to check those. And hopefully there's some helpful websites here from reputable organisations with lots of really useful tips that we can integrate into our everyday life to help us manage the anxiety that we're all feeling to some degree at the moment. And I hope those will be useful for us to have a look through and integrate into our lives. So I'm going to finish up there. I talked for a little bit longer than I hoped, but hopefully still leaving us plenty of time for questions or discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just in a sec. There you go. And I'm also going to turn on my camera so that you can see me if you want to, put a face to the voice.
Thank you, Helen. I just want to say there was one question that's come up twice. Will the slides be available afterwards?
Yes, you're very welcome to share my slides with the distribution list for people who've attended, Kate, or you can put them on the MNIST website if you want to.
That's great, thank you. Just wanted to check.
Can I just confirm the slides and the video of the recording of this workshop will both be available on the Radbold Trust medical needs section of our website, and I will send out a link to everybody.
Lovely, thank you so much both. Are there any other questions or comments or points for discussion that anybody wants to raise? Doesn't look like it, Kate. Oh, we've got somebody with their hand up. Miss Davis. I'm not sure that she's...
Hi, Helen.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Helen. It's Lynn. Thank you very much for your talk. I just picked up on the point where you spoke about structured and unstructured time for the students. So if you feel that a student could benefit from some unstructured time, how would you bring that in? Would you suggest that we actually timetable that, or if that comes up in conversation or during a lesson, during an online learning, or when the student is in centre? How do you think it would be best to to bring that up or use that facility?
That's a really great question, and I think, well, I suspect that it will probably vary according to how well you know the student and how much discussion you've had with them prior to raising it, in terms of, are they somebody that you know pretty well and you know that maybe they benefit from some time alone. I think I'm hearing that a lot of education staff are communicating by email at the moment. So whether, you know, if you are in a situation where there's lots of other young people there, obviously you might not want to bring it up. So dropping them an email and just, I guess, thinking with them about, do they want some space to talk about sort of pandemic life? And I often use the word pandemic life to young people at the moment, because they kind of get what you mean. And we don't need to say, you know, to have some space if there's anything that you're worried about. Young people often just say, oh yeah, I'm fine. But just to say, you know, let's catch up on how pandemic life is going, what are the challenges that you've been facing and so on, and to put it in that sort of low-key sort of way, I suppose. And we know that, I think at the moment, so many young people are juggling, you know, their parents being on calls all day, or their parents doing other things, and really lacking that one-to-one time sometimes that they might have had through the more pastoral support in school. And I'm hearing a lot of feedback that that's really helpful for young people who are struggling a little bit more. Hope that
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, it does. The reason why I asked specifically is because we have a student who's just lost their grandfather to COVID. Mm-hmm. And that student came into the centre this afternoon, and it was good to see that student, not really knowing how the student feels, or that's what they're communicating. And so wondering how we can facilitate their feelings and help them perhaps move forward or not move forward, as the case may be. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your suggestions. Maybe there's something there that we can use with that student. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think I saw, I'm not sure of your first name, sorry, is it Mrs. Montana had her hand up, but it's gone down now. But if you wanted to say something.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I didn't know if you could hear me. It's Angela Montana. Yeah, I did have my hand up. I was just querying, a lot of what you said completely makes sense with some of the students who I work with. The differences that you said between sort of the students and adulthood, and the differences with anxiety. When you're talking about 16, 17-year-olds, I guess I'm talking sixth form students, is it normal then? Because are they then beginning to feel the same as the adult anxiety? So that kind of adds extra anxiety because they've maybe been dealing with it in younger years, and then they hit that place where it's somehow different.
That's a really good question, and it's a really interesting stage developmentally for anxiety, because when we hit sort of 13 plus, we get much more sophisticated understanding of lots and lots of aspects of the world and of life. So we develop the ability to think hypothetically, to think of the future, to think of multiple and complex causes for situations. So causes that include things like stress, psychological factors, physiological factors. Our understanding of illness is much more sophisticated. So in theory, people at sort of the higher end of the teenage years are able to think in a much more sophisticated way. And of course, one of the downsides for that, particularly with people with maybe pre-existing anxiety, people with really vivid imaginations, is that it opens them up to a whole world of possibilities around anxiety and risk, which can really increase it in this age. And then that's really the big difference between the teenagers then and adults, is that it's also coupled with it being the developmental phase where you're most likely to be impacted on by social and peer influences. So you're trying to figure out your place in the world, you're trying to fit in. So in theory, you can think about things in a much more logical, rational, future-orientated way, but you're also drawn to the here and now, to what are my friends are doing, how am I going to fit in, and so on. And I think that the sort of melting pot of all those factors really complicates the presentation of anxiety in this age group, and particularly during the pandemic, where maybe somebody's desperately worried about pandemic related concerns, but also they know that their friends are meeting up outside in a group, and what do you do with that? Do you be the one that doesn't go, or do you then have the sleepless nights because you chose to go when you know that it's against the rules? So it's a really tricky age for anxiety, I think. Sorry, I feel like I kind of went off on one a little bit then. If there's anything more specific, Angela, you wanted me to comment on?
No, that did make sense. You know, I've got a student in mind who has struggled sort of recent, maybe 3-4 years with anxiety, and all of a sudden now seems less able to cope with it, but finds it more upsetting. I guess it's kind of that balance of trying to, or having the more understanding that actually this is something that I shouldn't be overly anxious about, however I am, and I guess that comes well. So yeah, that does help what you said.
Yeah, and I think it's for young people maybe predisposing anxiety factors like a history of anxiety. What we know is that in times of stress, people are much more likely to resort to their typical thinking patterns. So if it's somebody who has a history of anxiety, of maybe thinking about all of those different options that could happen now, they're likely to have a higher physiological sort of baseline of anxiety. So those feelings of maybe butterflies in the stomach, feeling hot, feeling fidgety, they're not going to take probably too much extra before you start feeling all those. So even in young people where perhaps it feels like, you know, they've always been anxious, and this is sort of another thing on top of that, and really difficult to manage. Even going back to basics of that sort of physiological relaxation every day, 5 minutes, just doing some deep breathing, doing some focusing on the here and now can be really helpful, even if it feels like it's going to be really difficult to treat this because maybe this is a long-standing issue.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments that people want to raise?
There's nothing else in the chat box, so it's just over to me, I think, Helen, to say, well, as ever, such a useful and really interesting presentation, and we're so grateful to you for sharing your expertise and giving us ideas as to how we can best support our young people and indeed ourselves at this time. It's interesting that you're doing dry January, Helen. I've gone for dry-ish January.
I like that. I'm going to steal that one maybe.
And I suppose I just ought to put a plug for our next planned workshop, which is on, at the moment, the 3rd of March at 4 o'clock on eating disorders. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Paul Garfield, a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, and also Sarah Cross from our local Suffolk clinical team for eating disorders here in East Suffolk. So they're going to be the presenters, so please put that date in your diary. And I suppose just to end on a final point, really, as Helen says, just to remember the importance of taking care of ourselves, and we must practice what we preach. If we're not taking care of ourselves, how can we be in a position to support others? So do rest, do something away from the computer this evening, something that makes you feel good, and then we'll be in a better position to support others around us. Many thanks again, Helen, and thank you to the rest of you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Helen.